Hi, I'm Wayne Welsh.
And I'm Joseph Venusa.
And this is another episode of our series on the book of Exodus. Today we're going to be talking about Exodus chapter 2, in which Moses is born, and in which, spoiler alert, he kills a guy. So let's go ahead and talk about just some of the things that are going on. Chapter 1, we looked at last time, had a lot of talk about the oppression of Israel and the difficulties they were going through as Pharaoh was trying to stop them from being fruitful and multiplying and becoming a potential threat to Egypt. Well, God has seen their oppression, and he's decided to do something about it through the person of Moses. So I guess we should look at the first 10 verses of chapter 2. Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a daughter of Levi. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was beautiful, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got him a wicker basket and covered it over with tar and pitch. Then she put the child into it and set it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to find out what would happen to him. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the Nile, with her maidens walking alongside the Nile, and she saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid, and she brought it to her. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the boy was crying. She had pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go ahead." So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. The child grew. She brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses, and said, "Because I drew him out of the water." So what I find interesting about that is that, like, God's not mentioned in those verses, right? You know, he's not mentioned by name. And yet, the text is rife with all of these, what shall we say, coincidences. Things that happen the opposite of the way we expect. This is one of those things where you see this trope a lot in the biblical narrative. Something just happens. Something extremely unlikely happens, and something else extremely unlikely happens. And the biblical authors want us to assume that it is, in fact, divine providence that's behind the whole thing. And I think we're definitely supposed to do that here.
Yeah.
God's raising up a deliverer. They're hiding him for. Well, they have this child. They like their son, hopefully, and they're trying to hide him for 3 months. And then her strategy to avoid him getting thrown into the Nile is to put him into the Nile, which is sort of opposite of what we expect. She's doing this so he won't be found by the Egyptians. And then as the story unfolds, he's found by the Egyptians.
Yeah.
And this winds up being not the thing that kills him, but the thing that saves him, because it's Pharaoh's daughter that finds him, and she has pity. She winds up going against her father's wishes on the way that his policies run on this sort of thing.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. Again, this whole thing with them putting the child in the Nile, again, it's almost like, I did what you said. But not really. But it's very much undermining Pharaoh's authority here. We saw that in the last chapter, the midwives who also do something similar. Now, his own daughter is, preserving the life of this child. Again, I think that's, you might think, oh, she's Pharaoh's daughter, she might be compelled to do the same thing, but outside of, whatever motivation Pharaoh has of fear and all of these things about the Israelites, joining their enemies and leaving, all these things, the daughter sees a child, has compassion. It doesn't see, all the fear that, he's worried about. He sees this child that needs to be taken care of.
One of the things I like to point out is callbacks to some of the Genesis stories.
Yeah.
In chapter 1, we were pointing out the callback to the Tower of Babylon story with the making bricks for mortar. Well, here, the very obvious callback, at least it's more obvious if you read Hebrew, I guess.
Yeah.
But the word for wicker basket here is not a very common word in verse 3. It's the word teba. The only other time in the Pentateuch, in fact, I might think the entire Hebrew Bible, I'd have to double check that. But the word here, teba, is used of the ark in the Noah's Ark story. Noah is told to build an ark of gopher wood and to cover it over with tar and pitch, and that is supposed to keep him safe from the impending judgment via water. Well, the same thing happens with Moses here. Moses is kept safe in a teba, covered with tar and pitch. He's kept safe from drowning in that. Now, we understood the reason that Noah is really saved in the teba is because of the hand of God. And we're supposed to understand something similar here in Exodus 2. But the threat itself is not coming from God's judgment on the world like it is in the Noah's flood story. It's coming from an enemy of God's people. It's coming from Pharaoh, this wicked figure, the villain of the story. Pharaoh, I think I've alluded to this last time, but Pharaoh is very much the stand-in for Satan in the story. He is very much the Satan's henchman. He acts in the role of the serpent in the garden. He tries to destroy God's people. He's very much the typical villain. It used to be back in the, in today's world, if you want to call somebody a name or you want to tell somebody how bad they are, the typical strategy is to compare them to Hitler in some way.
Yeah.
But sometimes people forget, well, there was a time before Hitler. Who do we compare awful people to then? And one of the most common points of comparison was the Exodus Pharaoh. So you can find like old news publications which will refer to people as a modern Pharaoh. They're making allusion to this story because that's how he's the bad guy in the story. He's the worst person people could think of.
I mean, the things that he does are terrible. Everything from enslaving the people of Israel to then killing their children to then his stubbornness, which then kills his own people. And it just goes on and on. Here, again, you have this big turnaround of not only is Pharaoh's daughter saving the child, but then paying the slave.
Pays the slave to nurse her own child.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So completely, doing the opposite of her father, Pharaoh.
Moses is... just like, the two midwives are conspiring to save the Hebrew boys before. Now Moses is saved by two significant women in his life.
Yeah.
His mother and his sister. And also Pharaoh's daughter. Another thing I think worth mentioning here, Pharaoh probably has more than one daughter because, spoiler alert, Pharaoh probably has more than one wife. There's a lot of popular portrayals of this in film. You think about the Ten Commandments or the Prince of Egypt or something like that, where it's just Pharaoh growing up with, it's just Pharaoh's son growing up with Moses, and that son goes on to become the opponent in the next chapters. And I mean, I guess it makes for good storytelling at the Hollywood level.
You gotta cut down all the cast.
It's probably not the true dynamic of this family. Like, Moses probably is never really a serious consideration, for instance, for heir to the throne or something like that. I think he would have lived a privileged life because he's growing up in Egypt. He gets the benefit of the education of the Egyptians. But it's highly unlikely that, he's on the same tier as the Exodus Pharaoh that we're going to meet in the subsequent chapters.
Yeah.
And given that he's 80 years old at the time of the Exodus, one wonders if he's even in the same generation as the Pharaoh he's confronting.
Yeah, there's a lot of questions of that. Again, where does he fall in age between that? So, do we want to jump to verse 11?
Yeah, let's go ahead and look at verses 11 to 15.
Okay, I'll go ahead and read that. It says, "One day, when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people, and looked on their burdens. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. When he went out the next day, behold, two Hebrews were struggling together. And he said to the man in the wrong, 'Why do you strike your companion?' He answered, 'Who made you a prince and judge over us? Do you mean to kill me, as you killed the Egyptian?' Then Moses was afraid, and thought, 'Surely the thing is known.' When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh, and stayed in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well."
So Moses kills a guy, and there's all kinds of questions, about what exactly is going on here. Moses kills the guy and tries to cover the whole thing up. Is he saving this other guy's life? Is it that they were in a brawl and things just got out of hand? how much can we read into Moses?
Self-defense.
Huh? Yeah, it's just a self-defense argument, right? If you think of, interpretations of this exist even in the New Testament, even because you get in Acts 7, probably most prominently, Stephen's speech in Acts 7:23, when he was approaching the age of 40, it enters his mind to visit his brethren, the sons of Israel, and when he saw one of them being treated unjustly, he, that's Moses, defended him and took vengeance for the oppressed by striking down the Egyptian. And he supposed that his brethren understood that God was granting them deliverance through him, but they did not understand. On the following day, he appeared to them as they were fighting together, and he tried to reconcile them in peace, saying, "Men, you are brethren, why do you injure one another?" But the one who was injuring his neighbor pushed him away, saying, "Who made you a ruler and judge over us? You do not mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday, do you?" And at this remark, Moses fled and became an alien in the land of Midian, where he became the father of 2 sons. That's Acts 7:22 through 29. Now, in the context of Stephen's speech there, it's his rhetorical back pocket example of how the Israelite people, the Jewish people, have always been rejecting the deliverers that God has sent to them. And he makes the point that, this is the Moses to whom the sons of Israel said, "Oh, who makes you ruler and judge over us?" in verse 35, is the one that God did send to be ruler and deliverer. And then he makes the comparison, by the way, you guys did the same thing with Jesus. God sent him to be your ruler and deliverer, and you basically just scorned him and acted reproachfully to him. Now, is that how we're supposed to read Exodus 2, or is that how Stephen is using Exodus 2 to make a point about Jesus? I think there's something to be said for this playing into the story of Israelite rejection, right?
Yeah. I think that's important though. Like, just because there's lessons that we can get from this doesn't mean that, that's the only lessons.
Right.
As well as, viewing it from what God's doing through Moses, again, doesn't always say, "Oh, that was perfectly fine," or things like that. No. I mean, I think there's enough examples throughout the Bible where that's the case, where, God uses the Babylonians, or God uses, these not so great people to accomplish his thing, his deeds.
Sure.
And so, just because, Moses is playing out a deliverance story doesn't mean, that's, perfectly fine in all things. So.
Yeah. Now, I'll admit, I'm a biased person. I tend to think that whenever the New Testament authors quote the Old Testament story or treat the Old Testament story in a certain way, that, that needs to be considered as a very serious reading of the text, if not the reading of that text. And that's how I at least arrive at a confirmatory power for certain interpretations. That said, I do think we also need to recognize that Old Testament stories are not always the black and white stories we treat them as, right? There's moral complexity to them. There's moral ambiguity to them. There's a lot of instances in Old Testament narrative where the author does not tell us what God thinks of the action. And that is done on purpose because we're supposed to think about it. And I think that Exodus 2:11 through 14 is one of those stories. And it's why you can find interpreters who, ancient interpreters even, who had problems like, well, Moses killed a guy. And how does that fit into the fact that he's the one who later gives the law and says, "Do not murder"? How does that ultimately play out into the broader scope of divine history and redemption and so on? And those are things to think about too. I will note, when Israel rejects God's deliverer, it delays their deliverance for 40 years. And so what happens, Moses is 40 years old, he goes to the land of Midian, 40 years go by, and now we're going to try again.
Yeah.
And what happens is it's not the last time that salvation will be postponed for 40 years, because they're going to do the same thing in Numbers 13 and 14. They're going to say, "Well, who made you ruler and judge over us? Let's appoint a new ruler and go back to Egypt." And that's what costs them entry into the Promised Land. So Israel's disposition, generational, they might have a generation pass between here and there, but their disposition from this story to the middle of Numbers does not really change that much. And it's what costs them considerably.
Yeah, I think just this section, and really the next section as well, these are kind of very similar, right? You have him approaching this Israelite and Egyptian, right? And delivers the Israelite from the Egyptian. Then you have 2 Israelites, and they reject his deliverance. And then the last one, which we'll get into in just a little bit here, is him delivering, our foreigners, essentially. These people are strangers. You talk about Stephen's speech.
Yeah.
And Israel rejecting, and then, Moses is now going to foreigners and delivering? Wait, what? I don't know. It seems like it's hinting towards, again, one of those things that, salvation is for all kind of things. That's just subtly in there that kind of hints towards that.
Yeah, I like that. And I mean, the other thing that strikes me too about all of this is, the complaint against Moses doesn't arise when he kills the Egyptian. The complaint against Moses arises when he tries to stop 2 Israelites from fighting each other. Mm-hmm. And one of them's like, well, you can't tell me what to do. I didn't have a problem with you killing the Egyptian until that same principle now applied to me.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. We like it when our enemies are the ones getting trashed. Not so much when it's us who are in trouble, because we're, doing the same things and practicing the same things. And so there's an implicit lesson there too, that the kind of punishment and of course we can always backtrack and say, well, I really wasn't ever okay with him doing that to my enemy. But we only saw it as something worth speaking out about when we were the ones that were affected by it. So there's another thought that comes into this as well.
Yeah, and that reminds me, of the parable that Jesus gives of the unforgiving servant, right?
Yeah.
Who here in the story we don't know if it's the same Israelite or not.
Right.
It'd be like, if only they added that detail. but in the story parable that Jesus gives of the unforgiving servant, he goes to his master, begs to forgive his debts, so that he isn't thrown in prison. But when it comes to him doing that for the servant, his servant who comes to him, he's not willing to forgive. He's not willing to show mercy. We don't want, the person I'm oppressing to be delivered from me.
We want deliverance at the expense of others, but not at our own expense. That's the main problem. And that's unfortunate. That's the way we think about these things. But, hypocrisy is not a new thing.
Yeah.
It's not a new thing among God's people, and we best guard and be wary against it. You alluded to it already, but I think it's worth looking at the well meeting in verses 16 to 22. The priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. And the shepherds came and drove them away. But Moses stood up and helped them and watered their flock. When they came to Reuel, their father, he said, "Why have you come back so soon today?" So they said, "An Egyptian delivered us from the hand of the shepherds. And what is more, he even drew the water for us and watered the flock." He said to his daughters, "Where is he then? Why is it that you have left the man behind? Invite him to have something to eat." Moses was willing to dwell with the man, and he gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses. Then she gave birth to a son, and he named him Gershom, for he said, "I have been a stranger in a foreign land." So this is a well meeting, and one of the tropes in biblical narrative is that anytime characters meet at a well, it's going to lead to marriage in some way. You see it with Abraham's servant going to find a wife for Isaac. He meets Rebekah at a well. By the end of the story, Rebekah and Isaac are married. Jacob meets Rachel at a well by the end of the story, and after some very convoluted shenanigans from Laban, Jacob and Rachel are married. Moses meets Zipporah at a well. At the end of the story, they're married. Now, of course, this comes back later in the Bible only to get itself subverted. Like when Saul meets women at a well, instead of getting married, he becomes king. Or when Jesus meets a woman at a well, and instead of getting married, he reveals to her, you've already been married 5 times. That's not what you need. That's in John chapter 4. But well meetings are being set up as sort of a trope where people find their future spouse.
I think the response is interesting as well. When, after he's delivered them, they come back to their father, right? And they're like, "Oh, where is he? What did you do with him?" In verse 20, said to his daughters, "Then where is he? Why have you left the man? Call him that he may eat bread." Again, I think kind of alludes to what's coming for Israel's deliverance, right? Mm-hmm. Is they are delivered, but once they're delivered, they're outside, and they're like, forget God. This is the end. Oh wait, there's something I'm supposed to, do? Should I brought God with us? He delivered us, and that kind of requires something that it's not something that you should. Oh, okay, I'm good now. Thanks. Never see you again, kind of thing. That there's some gratitude due there. I think that's kind of an interesting thing.
Right. One of the things that might trip us up a little bit is the discussion about who is Moses' father-in-law.
Yeah.
Because here in chapter 2 verse 18 it's Reuel, right, the Midianite priest, but then in the next chapter it's Jethro in chapter 3 verse 1, and Jethro is mentioned again in Exodus 18, and then you get to Numbers and there's a guy named Hobab, and what's he doing there? He acts as their guide in the wilderness, and there's a couple different strategies I guess people have come up with for trying to reconcile those things together. One is, of course, to claim that Reuel and Jethro are two names for the same person. More believable, at least to me, is the idea that because father can mean not just father, but ancestor or grandfather or things like that, that in fact what we're dealing with is Reuel and Jethro are simply father and son figures, and that Zipporah is one of the daughters, and that she is Moses' wife as a result. Which would make, you could legit refer to Jethro and Reuel as Moses' father-in-laws. But admittedly, there's not 100% certainty on that, right? So there's lots of questions that get raised. It's one of those things that kind of tantalizes people. But it's not really an unsolvable problem. It's that we're not sure which of the options before us is the correct one.
Yeah. Actually, here in verse 16, now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and there's questions about what is the priest over. We saw that in Genesis when Joseph marries into the Egyptian priest's family. And it's like, okay, well, probably pagans, but then you kind of have this question of like, okay, well, Moses marrying to this family, is he become, part of that? You kind of have that question of Joseph back in Genesis. And so it kind of brings up some interesting things with that. But again, we don't know a whole lot about.
So yeah, I mean, the nature of their belief, what they believed about God, and what they knew about God, is not the same as what we know about God, right?
Yeah.
Like, you and I sitting here, we have, like, the whole Bible in front of us. We have the New Testament in front of us. We could talk about Jesus, and we could talk about the concepts like the Trinity and things like that. Moses is not conversant in those concepts. Mm-hmm. Moses, as far as we know, is never conversant in those concepts in his lifetime, because he never meets Jesus. I mean, he gets glimpses and shadows of it in his writing, sure, but, the concept of God as we think about God is very far removed from what Moses is. And in fact, the concept of straight up monotheism, there are no other gods that exist whatsoever, it's just Yahweh, the Lord, and, the one God concept, even, is something that if Moses adopts it in his lifetime, he has to learn. But it's also possible to read it and think, well, Moses is in fact acknowledging that there are, quote, other gods, but there's only one God that we are supposed to worship and acknowledge, which is a very common worldview in the Old Testament, frankly. Yeah. And when we start reading things like this, we start reading about how God discloses himself to Moses. And God really reveals himself to Moses in chapter 3, in the burning bush, where he introduces himself as I am. And Moses doesn't know who he is. Moses says, who am I to say has sent me? What they're going to ask me what your name is. What is your name? Mm-hmm. And you get to Exodus chapter 6, and it's the same conversation. He says, I am Yahweh. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, but by my name, Yahweh, I did not make myself known to them, which indicates that Moses is learning things that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob didn't really know. So what is Jethro the priest of? He's probably not a priest of Yahweh.
Yeah.
And in fact, this gets confirmed when we get to chapter 18.
Yeah.
Because in chapter 18, Jethro the priest of Midian shows up, and he says, now I know. But in verse 10, Jethro said, blessed be Yahweh, who delivered you from the hand of the Egyptians and from the hand of Pharaoh, and who delivered the people under the hand of the Egyptians. Verse 11, now I know. that Yahweh is greater than all the gods. Indeed, it was proven when they dealt proudly against the people. You read that, he's clearly acknowledging the existence of other gods.
Yeah.
But because of the Exodus and because of the deliverance that's taken place, Jethro now says Yahweh is greater than all the gods. This is very much his conversion story.
Yeah.
He hears the news of the Exodus and he's drawn a conclusion about Israel's God. And that's important to realize, is that when we're reading the Old Testament, we're not reading... all of the information about God is not this static, monolithic, here it is all at once, you know it all at once.
Yeah.
God reveals himself gradually over time. And some of the things they think about God are not going to be in line with things we learn about God later in that story. So that's an important concept to remember as we're reading this. The incarnation of Jesus breaks open anew everything. Well, it takes everything you thought you knew about God and sort of reframes it and reinvents it.
Yeah.
But that's much further in the future for all of them.
Yeah. I think that's interesting just to think about. Again, when you're putting yourself in these stories, to put themselves, what did they actually believe? And what do you say? These priests, I'm not going to associate because they don't worship the true God. Well, he probably was. They worship God. I'll worship their God too. Yeah, until they get to the burning bush, and he may have been familiar with some stories about his heritage and stuff like that. But again, would that been just the God of Abraham, or were there other gods in that view as well? I mean, I think that's important to realize that was probably the case, and most likely the case. And I think that's important because when we're reading the story of God's delivering the people, and Moses' role in that is, we look at the people of Israel and they're kind of having a hard time accepting the golden calf. But Moses is not too far ahead of them as far as what he knows about God. He's just getting this information pretty freshly as well. He's not, he hasn't been like, oh yeah, I know all about this way before you guys. So this, the burning bush is not too long before he goes to Egypt and telling them about this. So his faith in God and his growing understanding of that, I think is, when you look at the people of Israel and how slow they are to accept that, I think is, helpful to see, Moses, we think of him as this big figure, but he's learning this, in some ways at the same time.
Right. A lot of these Old Testament figures, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, they're held up as these heroes of faith. And part of the reasoning behind that, like you say, you read something like Hebrews 11, is the fact that, they had faith in something that they didn't quite understand. They didn't see. They heard all these promises, but they never saw the end result of most of those promises. Moses gets to see the promised land from outside, but he never gets to enter it. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they see sons, but they don't see the nation that God promised them. And yet they walk by faith, trusting that, that this Yahweh who is leading me, this God whom I have met, who encountered, has my best interest at heart and is working to do good for me ultimately. Yeah. And such is the same for us. We know more about God now than they did back then, but that doesn't mean that we know everything there is to know about God. Yeah. What we need to know about God is, what we know about God is so infinitesimally small compared to what God still would have yet to tell us. And so once again, we're choosing to live by faith and to act in trust that God is going to cause all things to work together for good, that there is a resurrection of the dead, that there is something that we have not seen. It has not yet appeared what we will be. When we see him, we will be like him. We will see him as he is. And that gives us hope, and that gives us something to look forward to. And so like Moses, we're called to the same thing, to walk by faith without fully understanding everything, without having the exhaustive knowledge of all of it, because we're not going to.
Yeah.
Not this side of eternity, anyway.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good place to end, is thinking about that. So, with that said, I think, we thank you all for joining us, and we will be jumping into chapter 3 next time. So, Thank you all, and we'll see you then.
Thank you for joining us.